Almost every practice can be useful and complementary or harmful to your Scrum implementation. So, how's that? Hi, it's Daria here at Scrum Mastered. Today, let's talk about Scrum, the do's and don'ts. There are many processes and practices that are implemented by Agile teams across the world, and that's great. The problem is they are often associated with Scrum and they often shouldn't be. For example, the infamous 3 questions in the daily Scrum. It was always just a recommendation. However, many teams took it as a rule without considering any other options. This reduces the benefits of the daily Scrum as it's not focused on its primary purpose, but on a very specific practice instead. Here are the dangers of this situation. Your team might feel that there are too many rules in Scrum, too many processes, and it's not very flexible when it comes to how to do the work. The implementation might be getting so complex that instead of making the team's lives easier, it creates impediments. Some practices might not be even working for your team and your situation, which negatively impacts the effectiveness of the team. Essentially, your Scrum implementation becomes useless. It doesn't bring any benefits, only pain points. You want to avoid this if you want your Scrum team to actually succeed. So what can you do? Number 1, first, you need to make sure everyone's on the same page on what is absolutely required in Scrum. In Scrum, we have 5 events: sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, sprint retrospective, and the sprint itself as a container for the other events. Every event has a clear purpose, its place in the sprint, and a time box. Scrum doesn't tell us how to run any of the events and how to make them productive. We need to figure it out on our own. Then there are 3 accountabilities: Scrum Master, Product Owner, and developers. In the same way, every person in the Scrum team is accountable for something very specific. However, Scrum doesn't explain how each role can achieve their purpose or what tools they need to use. And lastly, we have 3 artifacts: the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment. Scrum is very specific about why they exist and their primary characteristics, but doesn't tell us how to manage these artifacts. This is why we say that Scrum is purposefully incomplete. It gives you the boundaries of the framework, but then lets you figure out everything else in between those boundaries. Work with your team to realign on the rules of Scrum and what is not Scrum. You can do this, for example, by running a training session. Shameless plug ahead, the Introduction to Scrum workshop that you can get in my store is a great workshop that you can run to help your team understand Scrum. By the way, before you teach your team Scrum, would you like to test your Scrum knowledge? I have created a simple true or false quiz that you can take on my website absolutely free. It will help you see how well you actually know Scrum. I am covering some common misconceptions there, and at the end of the quiz, you will get correct answers with detailed explanations to help you learn, and my recommendations on how you can elevate your knowledge and become more successful. I'll put the link in the description to that quiz. Number 2, figure out what practices and processes and other tools you're currently using that are additional to Scrum. This might relate to how you estimate your work, what tools you use for your product backlog and sprint backlog management, how you track progress, how you run your meetings, and many more. For example, you might be using story points for estimation, user stories and Jira for your product backlog, burn down charts to track sprint progress, for example. All of these are practices and tools that are not prescribed by Scrum. So look for details on how your team works together, especially if they're unhappy with something, because most likely this is a practice that was implemented and is not very helpful. Number 3, now that you have a list of what practices, processes, and tools you use that are not Scrum specific, it's time to see whether they are helpful or not. Almost every practice can be useful and complementary or harmful to your Scrum implementation. So how's that? Well, it all depends on how we use it and why. If you implemented a practice just because it's popular or used by other teams, but there was no specific pain point to address with it, then you're wasting team's time and effort. Some practices may be used as predefined rules in the organization, a must for every team to implement. This kind of defeats the whole concept of agility, where we regularly reflect on how to become more effective and then adjust our behavior accordingly, in the same way as we adjust our tools and practices accordingly. Every tool, practice, or process needs to be open to questioning so that the team can define better ways to achieve their goals. To help with that, look at your list from the previous step and review with the team what is helpful and what is not. Based on that, continue the discussion on how you can improve. Obviously, your sprint retrospective is a perfect place to do that. And if you're looking for tools to help you teach your team good Agile practices and run retrospectives that are productive, I encourage you to check what I have in Scrum Master's store. I continue to expand the offering to give you as many practical materials as possible. Well, I hope you learned something new today, and if you did, you know it, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. So click that like button right down below. And I hope to see you next time. Cheers and Scrum on.